Hello automators, thanks for tuning in again. I have a breakdown here for how iOS and the iPhones in general and iPads will work in your home and your smart home specifically. What we're going to do today is go through the benefits and some of the negatives for iOS and iPhones in your smart home. Since its inception, iOS has really been the front runner in terms of a lot of great capabilities and functionality, and the biggest thing that they've always been on the front end of is applications, or apps as we like to call them today. Now, the applications that you have access to as an automator, really, it's everything out there. There's maybe one omission that I'll get to here in a minute, but you have If This Then That, you have Stringify, you have Yonomi, you have the Yeti application, and really you have access to all of the major makers of smart home equipment, so Google, Amazon, Samsung, and of course Apple. Now, that's where things start to differentiate between iOS and say Android. You have HomeKit, and HomeKit is Apple's own platform for smart things around your home. HomeKit has some benefits and it has some drawbacks. Now, ultimately, HomeKit is Wi-Fi based, or it's not really a hub. It doesn't really act like a hub. They give you access now to use devices like the HomePod as a hub, but ultimately you don't really have a hub that manages devices on Zigbee networks, and you don't have hubs that manage Z-Wave networks. So really, you're limited to, in general, Wi-Fi devices. What is very impressive about HomeKit to me is, even without that hub, what you do have access to is still some pretty good automation, or a medium level of automation through HomeKit, whereby you can trigger things when you trigger on a light. You can trigger things when you return home, or everyone leaves, or somebody leaves. You're also able to trigger things off of sensors. Now, we have to talk a little bit about hardware, because ultimately the iPhones and the iPads are one component to that, but the hardware around HomeKit devices tends to be more expensive, just like the hardware on the phones themselves. So what you are buying into is a little bit more of an expensive ecosystem of home automation when you buy into an iPhone and start using Apple HomeKit. Now, that isn't to say that HomeKit isn't good. It's just only good at a few things and is relatively expensive versus, say, something like Samsung SmartThings or another Z-Wave hub, a Homey hub, or things like that, where you can go and get relatively inexpensive sensors. And the comparison I'm really going to give you is a SmartThings sensor will cost you $20 to $25, whereas in general, when you're looking at sensors on the HomeKit side of things, you're talking about a $50 sensor. If we're talking about automation on an iPhone, an iPad, or anything related to Apple devices, we have to talk about their voice assistant. Now, Siri is on board these devices, and she is relatively capable when it comes to voice assistants. And if I was talking to you a year ago, you probably would have laughed at me for saying that. But now Siri reliably or consistently, on tests that are going on in the industry, is the second most capable and the second most accurate voice assistant on the market today. So not only is she capable of utilizing your smart home or home automation equipment that you have connected to HomeKit, but now with something called shortcuts, she is capable of running a lot of automation that you can create or get from other people on your iPhone. Speaking of shortcuts, this is looking into the future. Now, shortcuts is a highly capable, essentially scripting application, or the basis of programming application on your iPhone, and it used to be called Workflow. So Workflow was really one of the first things that you could go and add multiple actions off of one command. You could push a button, or you could trigger something, and then you could have multiple actions. Now, what's amazing about shortcuts, and what I really look to the future in with iOS, is shortcuts. The integration with Siri is great because you can have any shortcut triggered by Siri. Now, on top of that, the shortcuts, I have seen things where there's scripts basically right on the phone, and that is built by someone. They go and they build that. On top of that, you can also trigger different things in applications, so you can send content to applications. For example, you can send a picture to Instagram and have it pre-loaded or fully filled out, basically your description and your tags, before you get into Instagram, and that picture's all loaded and ready to go. On top of that, and this is the really impressive stuff to me, I've seen web server side scripts being run by shortcuts. And what I mean by that, I use a couple of shortcuts on a relatively daily basis. When I look at Amazon products and I want to know what the price history is, I have an application or a shortcut on my phone that I can actually just hit the share button, go to that shortcut, and then get the full price history for that item. So very, very impressive functionality. And I do that all with one press of the button, and it works on Amazon.ca, Amazon.com. It works really on any of them, and it gives it to me in whatever dollar output I'd like. All of this capability is on a platform that is clearly not going away. iOS is here to stay, and even, I mean that as a little bit of a negative. I don't see Apple going and rebuilding iOS to launch into the future and to really give us a new world to live in. They're still relying on their big app store to give you all kinds of functionality, and they're still relying on a lot of things from iOS that have been built for many, many years. So it's starting to feel a little old to me, and it does feel like Android and the new Fuchsia OS that Google is producing could leap ahead of iOS. Some of the biggest limitations for Apple on iOS and their iPhone devices are self-imposed, and this is Apple trying to keep you in their ecosystem or in their system, and especially HomeKit and Siri. Now, what they've done most recently with shortcuts is they actually stopped Google from using it in a really, really powerful way. So what you used to be able to do is trigger your Google Assistant to run something with a shortcut through Siri. So you could just literally hold the button on your iPhone, have Siri come up, and you could say the trigger word for your shortcut, and then it could run Google Assistant. Now, what Apple immediately did was close off components of that. And we've seen them do this with things like Google Maps, which is still, in my opinion, the better Maps application. We see them do this with email. They don't really allow you to use another default email or browser or any of those things. So they really close off the system, and this creates limitations. So we're not going to be able to, as home automators using an iOS device, ever utilize the Google Assistant, which is the most powerful voice assistant on the planet, and I think it will be for a very long time, or Amazon's voice assistant, which is the most popular voice assistant on the planet right now on our iPhones, or not in a very easy to use or highly integrated way, because Apple keeps closing that off. Now we have to switch over to hardware, because we do have to talk about what you're building on if you're using iOS. Now we've seen HomePod come out, and relatively I would say HomePod has not gone very far, and I like the device in my home, don't get me wrong. I really enjoy it, and again, what Apple does, they do really well at. So there's nothing on HomePod that I have been frustrated by. Whereas, when you look at the Google Home and the Amazon Echo series of products, you can get frustrated by things that they don't do because they're trying to do so much, or things that they don't do well because, again, they're trying to do so much. Now, on the flip side, HomePod only does a few things right now, but what it does it accurately, and it does it really well. It's very seamless, and it was easy to set up. On top of that, the HomePod speaker is literally unparalleled. I have not had a better speaker, and for people who already like iPhones, and this goes to you folks with spouses, I was able to get my wife to start using home automation equipment only after I got Siri in the house on the HomePod. On top of the HomePod, you of course have iPhones and iPads. Now, if you already have one of those devices in your home, it's really easy to have HomeKit basically go across in your home to your other iOS device. So it's really just about hitting a share button or an invitation button and sending that invitation to the other device. Some of the drawbacks of iOS and these iPhone devices, to me, ultimately, when you look at Android and you see the widget capability, and we have a little bit of a widget capability now on iPhones and iPads where we can kind of swipe to the left and we go to that widget interface and we get one or two things that are useful. The difference to me on an Android is you can go ahead and really create a dashboard for yourself. And that to me will be more and more powerful as we go forward. And this triggers me into talking about HomePod 2. And we talked a little bit about HomePod, but ultimately HomePod 2 is what I see being the device that changes this for iOS. What do I mean by that? It's already been reported that we're going to see Face ID on HomePod 2. So to me, that means it's a tablet. In my opinion, the Apple HomePod 2 will actually be an iPad that you could probably mount somewhere and will have a very good HomeKit based interface to control your smart home. So it's not going to be less expensive than the HomePod, it's going to be more expensive. Finishing off the hardware discussion, ultimately when you look at an iPhone these days, it is $1,000 plus. And there's very few versions of their products. I know they have the XR right now that are under $1,000. And we're talking US dollars here. So these are very, very expensive devices. And again, I don't think HomePod is going to be cheaper. I think we're going to get a more expensive version, and the original HomePod might get shrunk down a little bit to become a little less expensive. But ultimately, Apple's devices are very, very expensive, and you don't have the range of options that an Android device does. So really what I'm telling you about iOS as a device in your smart home or for your smart home, it is relatively powerful and the shortcuts feature really excites me. But the expense of these devices sometimes outstrips what I believe is their capability for your smart home. So if managing your smart home is going to be really important for you, in the end, you may want to look at Android devices. Now, in the coming weeks here, or in the coming days rather, I'm going to be talking about Android and how it does compare to iOS and what you have to watch out for with Android devices. So stay tuned for that, guys, and we'll see you next time.